Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and happy holidays, and welcome back to another historian's interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia. Maybe you know me as the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. And joining us today is a historian making their official debut here on the show. Now, my guest today served for 21 years in the United States Navy, qualifying in both submarines and surface warfare. He held the rank of Chief Petty Officer before he retired and was rated as a damage controlman. And in addition to being a historian, he's also a published author, in which he wrote several works, including A Good and Favorable Wind, No More Heads or Tails, The Adoption of Welding in U.S. Navy Submarines, The Devil in the Details, and the Visual Guide series on U.S. Navy submarines. He also is a webmaster for pigboats.com, a naval history website, and works as a volunteer researcher for the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command. He also serves as a historian for the USS Dorado Project, an initiative to find the lost submarine USS Dorado SS-248. Additionally, he contributed to the photographic and video analysis that led to the discovery of 7 lost World War II submarines and 1 destroyer. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to our guest today, historian, author, and military veteran, David Johnston. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. I appreciate you having me on. It's an
Awesome,
honor.
David. I'm so excited to have you here. And honestly, you're probably now the second historian that I've had on the show that has a background in the United States Navy.
Excellent. There's a lot of great history and heritage in the U.S. Navy. As a Chief Petty Officer, one of our main goals was to promote and preserve that heritage and to teach it to younger sailors. And I really kind of took that on. It's been a lifelong pursuit of mine.
Nice. Very, very nice, David. So before we go into your background, as a little icebreaker question, is there a little fun fact that not a lot of people know about you, either professionally or personally?
A little fun fact. I'm a pretty straightforward guy. There's not too many, hidden fun facts involved there. Probably one thing is that I actually, even at 61 years of age, I enjoy building Lego. It's kind of a fun pastime. I'm looking forward to having my grandchildren involved in that. And I've got several Lego pieces here in my office, and it's a fascination that I never outgrew, even as an adult. So
nice. That's awesome, David. That's awesome. I of course love Legos as well. Love building them. Love building anything I could find. I'm actually getting back into Legos again, which is awesome. And honestly, just the creativity behind it, just so fascinating. And especially, I was actually working with a friend of mine. They were actually building a custom replica of what battleship was it? At the time, it was the USS Arizona. They actually were able to get custom pieces to recreate the USS Arizona, which is amazing. It was so cool to see that and how someone was able to bring that to life. And just the history behind the Arizona and many other ships like it in naval history is just amazing. And honestly, in my opinion, I don't think naval history gets a lot of recognition as opposed to the other branches in the United States military. So before we go into your background as an historian, David, let's talk a little bit about your time in the service. So what really pushed you to go into the Navy? Was it, did any family members who served in the Navy beforehand, or was it sort of something that you made a decision? How did that come about?
Well, it's kind of an interesting story. There's really not a whole lot of members of my family that have been in the military. My dad, he served in the Army for 2 years back in the early 1950s, and he really was the only other one. My grandmother on my dad's side, she was actually a Rosie the Riveter during World War II. She built B-24 bombers at the Willow Run plant in Michigan. And my grandfather on my mother's side, he was too old to serve, but he worked in a machine shop in Michigan that built some of the subcomponents that were used at Willow Run. But that was really about it. My dad served 2-year stint in the Army, and when I started to grow into my teen years, I got fascinated with military service. My dad had several books that I picked up and read. And strangely enough, when I was in high school, I was first looking at the Coast Guard. Being from Michigan, born and raised in southeastern Michigan, serving in the Coast Guard appealed to me because I could come back and serve the people of my home state, at the Coast Guard stations there. But as it turned out, I actually went to the Coast Guard recruiter and talked to them. And they said, well, don't call us, we'll call you. It's going to be 6 to 8 months minimum before we can take you in. And we're not even sure then. And by that point, I was a senior in high school, and I talked to my mom and dad, and I said, look, if I wait that long, I'm afraid I'm going to chicken out. So I went down the street to the Navy recruiter, and they said, yeah, when do you want to go? So I made my decision right then and there. One of my childhood fascinations had always been with submarines. I know, most kids are looking at cars or something like that nature, but I was fascinated with submarines. So I volunteered for the submarine service, and I moved in that direction, and I've never looked back. It's been one of the best parts of my life.
Nice. Very, very nice. And while you were in the service, when did you sort of become ingrained and fascinated by the history of the United States Navy? Was that during your time in the service or afterwards?
Well, it actually started beforehand. My dad had a first edition copy of a book by Edward Ellsberg called On the Bottom. And it was about the story of the sinking and salvage of the submarine S-51 back in 1925. And I read that book cover to cover probably a dozen times before I even got into high school. And that's really what kind of got me started in it. And then my service in the Navy in the early 80s, in 1983 to 87, just furthered that. And I served on a diesel electric submarine, forward deployed over in Sasebo, Japan. I spent 3 years over in the Western Pacific. And being able to sail that submarine through some of the areas that the World War II submariners fought in was just endlessly fascinating to me, and it just furthered my interest in history. And I was embedded in it. It was all around me at that point in time. So yeah, it kind of furthered my interest in history as I served in the Navy. Yep.
Nice. Now, in regards to your published works, what was the aha moment that really pushed you down that path? What really sparked that interest to not only talk about history, but to also write about it?
Well, one of the things that I became actually a little frustrated with as I pursued my interest in history was how often photographs were misidentified. You go into a book at that time. There was no internet back in those days, but you go into a book, you pull it open, and you look at it, and it would have a picture of a submarine, and the author just completely messed up the identification. And I started seeing this more and more and more, especially when the internet picked up in the early 90s, and dozens and dozens of websites sprang up, and people were just getting it wrong all the time. And one of my very first published works was the visual guide series that I wrote out of a sense of frustration that sometimes trained people that should know better, were still getting the identifications wrong and details wrong. So I wrote those down. They've gone through, probably 6 or 7 different versions over the years as I've updated them and learned more. And it was really designed to set the record straight so that when people were studying this kind of stuff, they'd have a reference to go back to know what they were looking at and be able to gain the proper facts and the real facts and the truth out of what they were looking at in the photos.
Very nice. Very, very nice, David. And now we actually get into a fan question, several fan questions that I'll be asking you throughout the interview.
Okay.
And one of my viewers asked this question, and I think this is a really good one because I actually had this similar question when I went to my local Barnes and Noble. And this viewer asks, and this is a long one, so I'm going to paraphrase. So, over the past few days, I have been trying to find a perfect gift for my special someone. Big history buff, loves everything about history. And he, of course, is going into the Navy. And so they were trying to find a book about the Navy at a local Barnes and Noble. But to her surprise and many more, there's not a lot of reference books or nonfiction books about the United States Navy, as opposed to a lot of books on the Marines, the Army, and the Air Force. And she'd like to know, in your opinion, David, why do you think there's not a lot of historical nonfiction reference research books out there for the general public to read, as opposed to the other branches, which there are so many? There's a plethora of for people to look into.
Well, that's a really good question. I think it depends upon how much digging you're willing to do. There's actually a lot of reference books out there. There's novels. There's first person accounts. I've got several of them sitting on my shelf here behind me, and a whole host more in my main bookcase here on the other side of the screen. I think maybe in general, some of the accounts made by soldiers, especially in World War II, in Europe, in the Pacific, soldiers and Marines, those first person, I was there type accounts tend to get a little bit more attention. Band of Brothers by Stephen Ambrose is a classic. As a matter of fact, I absolutely adore that book. It's some of the best history that's ever been written. And you're getting right into the nitty-gritty, individual personalities, whereas the Navy tends to be more crew focused. Instead of talking about the exploits of an individual, the Navy is very team oriented, and it's not just one person that's doing it all, it's the crew. And maybe that lack of personal attachment sometimes affects the way that the books are written or how many books are written. Although I will say again, I've got several examples, both behind me and behind me, that of books that are written by World War II naval officers and enlisted men that were absolutely outstanding works, and I would highly recommend them. I can give you some specifics if you're interested.
Nice, absolutely. I'll definitely take you up on that after the interview. And another fan question, one of my viewers asked, is, as an historian, when you're telling people or talking to others about the history of the United States Navy, what do you think are the biggest stereotypes or misconceptions people have about the United States Navy in terms of the history behind it?
Well, first off, and I think this is more of a generalized observation about all of the services, is that there's a tendency for people who have not served before to think of service members, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, that there are these mindless robots that just simply follow orders. You have to remember, these were men, and they were human beings, and they had all of the same emotions, they had all of the same foibles and imperfections, and all of the same great qualities that every other human being has. They were just put in extraordinary situations. So I think that the one of the main misperceptions is that they're unfeeling, automatons, robots that just simply follow orders, and that you couldn't have anything further from the truth. The 80 men that I served with on board my submarine were individuals, and yet they were individuals devoted to their brothers on board. And so, yeah, that's a misperception there. I think that if you read more of the first person accounts, you'd start to realize that very thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's actually something that I remember sharing with another guest I had on the show, Lynn Marks. She and I are both Marine parents. My father is a Marine veteran of 1st Marine Division, the Marine Raiders. She is also of the Marine Corps family. And I remember we were talking about something very similar funnily enough, on the eve of the Marine Corps birthday about this same thing. And it's just a very eye-opening thing. And you're absolutely right, David, that a lot of people have this misperception about service members, whether that's, Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force, any person serving in the military, from combat units to medics to technicians, maintenance, what have you, that they are these cogs in a machine. But that's furthest from the truth. And I definitely think there needs to be a lot more books that highlight not only the individuality of certain individuals that do go beyond the call of duty, but also highlight the extraordinary men and women and the teams they're a part of who have made the great sacrifices for this great nation.
Right. Yeah, there's one of my favorite books is by a submariner named Richard O'Kane. He was a Medal of Honor awardee from the Second World War. And he wrote actually two books, one about his account or his service aboard a submarine called the Wahoo, and another about his service aboard a submarine that he commanded called the Tang. And if you read through those two books, you will actually discover that Richard O'Kane, despite his bravery, was subject to all the normal imperfections that any other human being was. I mean, he came dangerously close once to insubordination with his first commanding officer aboard the Wahoo, because he just simply did not agree with how he was running the ship. So it's fascinating when you look at these and you read those first person accounts, that you get that these people were human beings just like everybody else.
Very true. Very, very true. And now kind of seeing on the side of the historian, David, when you're talking about history, sharing with the new recruits, the new sailors that were under your command, or even in your publications that you have written, or even posting a blog on your website, ultimately for you as a historian and as a researcher, what is your goal with every project that you're a part of when talking about the history of the Navy, and ultimately your promise, not just to yourself as the author and researcher and historian, but also to the people who are going to be either listening to your reports, your discussions, or reading it for themselves?
Well, one of my main goals, and this is going to sound overly simplistic, but it really is true for me, is a pursuit of the truth. In today's world, with social media and things like that, historical tales tend to get a little obscured by personal, political agendas and what have you. And quite often, the truth of the matter gets obscured or pushed aside. And my goal really is the truth. And then once I'm able to distill that down to the truth, I try to take it and relate it to the modern world. And when somebody goes out and they drive around in their hometown, they have to understand how that hometown came to be. Like I live here in Norfolk, Virginia. It's one of the most historical places in the country. And if you understand the history of the place, you're going to have a better appreciation for what you're seeing and how it came to be, why you're able to drive down the street in Norfolk, Virginia. And so when you find the truth, and then I try to take that truth and I find a way of applying it to the modern era so that you can understand the world that you're currently living in.
Very true.
That's the main goal, really. Yeah.
I think that's a really good one. That's a really, really good goal and motivation to have. And when you brought up social media, that is something that we are going to be touching on very soon in this interview. But before we get that, we then have a few more fan questions. Some of these I think are really, really cool and lighthearted. So this one talks about more so on your publications, David. And this viewer asks, when you were writing your works, this is a two-parter, what was the most incredible thing that you've uncovered as a researcher? And when authoring one of your works, what was probably the most difficult thing to write, either in terms of transforming research into prose or telling a cohesive story in a section of a book or so?
Well, one of the most surprising things that I came across was some revelations about the personality and character of Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz. He led the U.S. Pacific Fleet during the Second World War, and the book that I wrote is called A Good and Favorable Wind, which just very briefly is about an incident that befell one of our submarines in 1921. And as it so happened, Chester Nimitz was the squadron commander. He was a commander at that time, not an admiral. He was the squadron commander, and it was his responsibility to conduct the investigation into this incident, to try and figure out what happened, and then to try and prevent it from ever happening again with his other submarines that he was responsible for. And it was, I knew a little bit about Nimitz prior to that, but not a whole lot. And what surprised me is how he actually handled the investigation. What were the conclusions that he came to, and how he, in the end, dispensed the necessary discipline, because it was a mistake that was made. He was a very insightful person. He realized that he himself had played a role in the incident for several reasons. And then in the aftermath, how he handled the discipline that he put out was very even, very fair, and it really provided us several lessons in leadership that can be applied to today's modern Navy. I like to think that my book is a primer on how to investigate an incident and how to pass out even-handed and fair discipline in the aftermath. Really based on Chester Nimitz's example and how he led that, how he ended up the investigation. And what was the second part again? I'm sorry.
Of course. So the second part of the fan question was, as a researcher and an historian, what was probably the most difficult thing you've had to uncover to add to a project that you were working on?
Well, one of the things that was difficult that came about as, again, a bit of a surprise, is when I was writing the article that I wrote about the introduction of welding in U.S. Navy submarine construction. And prior to me writing that article, there was a common misperception of when welding, which is an extremely important aspect of submarine construction, was introduced. And at one point, my research partner, my website partner, and I, Rick Hedman, we received a whole series of photographs that a fellow researcher had uncovered at the National Archives. And it was on a particular submarine called the Dolphin from the early 1930s. And those photos showed that welding was incorporated into the construction of submarines much earlier than what the historical record would lead you to believe. And that came as a fairly strong shock. At first, I didn't even realize what I was looking at until Rick probed me and says, look further, that's a welding bead. And I took a look at it, and we looked more and more of the pictures, and pretty soon we realized that what we knew prior to that was actually incorrect, and it required a correction of the historical record. And it's not that previous historians had made mistakes, it's just that previous historians maybe not have had the full picture or fully understood what they were looking at.
Very true. Very, very true. Now, there's another question that I've wanted to ask you, and I would like to hear your thoughts on it, David. And I think it's probably one of my favorite questions to ask guests on the show. And that is, of course, dealing with imposter syndrome and what I like to call the historian's block and the narrator block and the writer's block and all that stuff all together. Ultimately, the block that stops all of us, because no matter who we are in those fields that I've mentioned before and more, we are always going to encounter days where we don't know what to write about, or we are stuck on a project that we really can't find a way to unravel. And even when we do, there's this hesitancy to share our work with others, let people know what we've worked on, because we don't know if they're going to take us seriously, if they're going to give us the opportunity to showcase our talents, our research, and so forth. I know for me personally, that took a while to really come to grips that I was an historian. I did go to school, got my MA in history, but I didn't go down the road of a professor or a TA. That wasn't for me. But I love writing about history, and I love highlighting aspects of history, people from history. And it really took a long time for me to really own that and feel comfortable saying that I am an historian. For you, David, have you ever encountered those uh, roadblocks in your personal life? And when did you feel the confidence to tell people, saying, I'm an historian and a writer, and I love talking about history?
Well, I think anybody that's ever put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard will have run into a writer's block at some point. I think it's a natural process. So don't ever think that you're alone in the wilderness in that regard. When I wrote my book, and I must state to make sure it's correctly stated, my book is I co-authored the book. My good friend and website partner Rick Hedman started a book about the submarine R-21 many years ago, probably 20 years ago, and he got quite a ways going, and then he ran into a huge case of writer's block. And I think, and him and I have both discussed this, so I'm not revealing any secrets or anything, but what he admitted that he didn't know what direction to take the book. And the problem that he ran into is he was trying to tell 4 or 5 or 6 different stories at once, and he couldn't figure out what direction to take it from there. So one day he called me and he says, Dave, I've got this manuscript I've been working on for 10 years or more. And he says, I just don't know what to do with it. Can you take a look at it? And I said, sure. So I took a look at it. I'd already knew about a little bit about the story of the R-12, R-14, and what had happened to it. Ran out of fuel, had to set sails and sail back to Hawaii. I'd already known about it, but the level of detail that Rick had gone into was new to me. So I read through his manuscript, and I decided to distill it down to one storyline, and that was telling the story of the R-14, her crew, how they figured their way out of the box they had gotten themselves into, and how they got home, and then also the aftermath and how the story was dispensed out. And I took the other directions that Rick had been going in, and I kind of put them off to the side. So I think what many authors will run into in terms of writer's block is a lack of focus. And I think you need to take a look at the story, decide what the core story is about, and then go down that path and eliminate the other directions, because it can start pulling you off in so many different directions that you lose focus and you run into writer's block. Mm-hmm. And even with that said, as I took over the project and started adding my portions to it, there were times in which I had to stop and step back, because one of the things I didn't want to do is be overly critical of the crew. I mean, I realized that the crew had made mistakes. It's one of the reasons that they ran out of fuel. But I didn't want it to be an indictment of them, because they are fellow submariners, and fellow submariners stick together. So I needed to frame the narrative in such a way that it told the story, and it told the story in a truthful and realistic manner, but that I wasn't poking anybody in the eye, because that wasn't my goal. I'm not there to indict someone. I'm there to tell the story. And my real goal at the end was to distill the lessons learned and see if they applied to the modern Navy. And I found out that they actually did, the generalized lessons, that is. So yeah, when you run into writer's block, I think it's because you tend to lose focus. And I think that's the most important thing. Find out what your story is about, or decide what your story is about, and then write that story and eliminate the side stuff, because that will help you get you back on track.
Couldn't agree more, David. Couldn't agree more. And before we get into what I like to call the reflective questions, there was one more question that I did want to ask you. And that is, of course, when you began this journey of your life of being an author, in addition to being an historian, when the book was published, when you and your fellow co-author published the book and shared it with people, what was the general reaction like from friends and family?
Well, friends and family were totally supportive. As a matter of fact, my wife Teresa was my primary editor. She was an English teacher. She ran the writing center at a local university. So I really relied on my wife to take a look at it and read through it and says, you need to rephrase this, or you need to add a comma here, or eliminate one here, whatever it was. So Teresa was very supportive of the effort, and she was my primary editor. And the rest of my family, I have a large family. I'm one of 7, so I have 4 sisters and 2 brothers, and a whole host of nieces and nephews, and they were all very supportive of it as well. Once the book was actually out in print, so far we've gotten very good reviews. Not a lot of them, but the reviews that we have gotten have all been universally very positive, and that gave me a lot. They gave me a lot of encouragement and validation that the route that Rick and I took on the book was the correct one. It's not a very large book. The story is fairly compact. I mean, most people could sit down and read it in one day, but it seems to have resonated with people, and we've gotten good reviews on it. And the support that I have gotten has been very, very gratifying, and it made me feel good about it. It's not a bestseller. You're not going to see it on the New York Times list, but I wanted to get that story out there so that it was told, so that people realized that this unusual incident about a submarine running out of fuel and having to raise sails and sail back to port, that it was a real story, and to give the facts behind it. And also it's Rick's legacy. Rick started that book. He asked me to finish it for him, and I really wanted to get it out there so that Rick would have that legacy of a book in print with his name on it. So, yeah.
Amazing, David. Absolutely amazing. And now we go into the reflective questions. And the first question we'd like to ask you is, of course, what I'd like to have called being an historian in the digital age. And something that you also touched on early in the beginning is that social media has greatly changed the way we share history. I mean, the history field has changed dramatically within the last 20 years or so. You've seen a rise in historical content creators, people who were also in the military, now retired, now talking about history, bringing to light some forgotten stories. There have been so many incredible stories that I've learned from these individuals, and just blows my mind. But with that said, you also have the dangerous side of social media, which is something that you've also brought up, David, is the presentation of information can be misconstrued by various political platforms and change to suit an agenda and so forth, and the truth often gets lost. And I love talking with people about this thing because, yes, social media is a great tool to have if you want to use it to grow your platform, grow your brand, so to speak, and get the word out there of what you like to tell people. But it is emotionally draining, it's exhausting, and we do leave ourselves exposed to the darker side of social media. So ultimately, David, the question I pose to you is this. With all that said and more, what has still disciplined you to still be the same person you were then as you are now, sticking true to your core values?
Well, it's not an easy question to answer. I will tell you that I have wasted, unfortunately, a lot of time on some social media platforms responding to posts that are almost laughably incorrect. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on when I read an article about, I think they called it rage clicking. And the intent on some of these things is to put something out there that is incorrect, that will prompt people to respond to it and say, look, man, you messed this up. in order to get somebody to respond to it, to click on it, even if it's a dislike, it gains the site and it gains them attention, which therefore gains them some advertising revenue. So in recent weeks, I've decided I'm just not going to do that because it's just not worth it. Especially with the rise of AI, you'll see a lot of AI generated images that are almost laughably incorrect. An example I can give you is several weeks ago, I found one on one of the social media platforms about the R-14 and the sailing incident. And the poster had used AI to generate an image of the submarine with the sails raised that they couldn't have gotten any more wrong than if they deliberately tried to get it wrong. And it's the danger with something like that is that it can muddy the waters. It can distort the historical record. If somebody looks at that AI generated image and takes it as real, they're going to get an incorrect interpretation of what actually happened. So this type of thing, I view it, it's two sides of the same coin. You've got the angel and the devil at the same time. I actually use ChatGPT for some research. It helps coalesce down some ideas. You can ask it specific questions. It will spit stuff back. And in some cases, it will send it back to you in a form that is very readable and very understandable. But you have to be extraordinarily careful with it, that you don't draw the wrong conclusions, because ChatGPT has been laughably wrong on many occasions. Sometimes I ask it questions that I already know the answer to as a test, and they've gotten it laughably wrong. That just means it needs the algorithms tweaked, and it needs more references, which I provide it with references, and it comes back and can correct the record. But for the average person that has an interest or a passion for history and is doing research, you need to be very, very careful about the sources that you're going to. Social media can provide you with some good information. There are some posts and some sites that do have some really nice information on there, but a lot of them are just really, really bad. So you need to go back to reputable sources. You need to go back to published authors and people that have done the proper background research and can give you the straight information. And bounce it off what you're seeing on social media, bounce it off what you're seeing on the internet, because not every internet website is good either. So do that research, get multiple different sources. I don't want to poke eyes here again, but Wikipedia has gotten a bad reputation in the past, but they are actually improving. Wikipedia is not the terrible source of information that it used to be. The moderators on Wikipedia have done a really good job of instituting rules about providing references, about providing the background information, and a lot, I would say most of what you're finding in Wikipedia now can be trusted, again, to a certain extent. I would encourage you to go and pull up different sources and take a look at it. A lot of for instance, a lot of the pages on U.S. submarines, I've gone back and personally edited the Wikipedia pages and put in their proper references so that people understand and people know that they're getting the correct information. So yeah, my major piece of advice would be to double check your references, look at more than one reference, and sometimes you'll get a different viewpoint as well that will give you a better understanding of what you're taking a look at.
Absolutely. And I remember even in schooling, one of my professors even said that Wikipedia is not the end-all be-all of sources, but it's a good starting point. You can definitely use Wikipedia as a starting point to figure out, okay, this topic sounds interesting. Let's dive a little bit more, because normally Wikipedia will include the bibliography of where it drew its sources from. And then from there, we can check those sources and those are. So you're absolutely right, David. You're absolutely right. And on the topic of AI, that actually leads to the follow-up question, which is whether or not, with the rise of AI, the field of history has either entered a dark age. I'll definitely give some context to this question. So I've been doing the show now about 6, 7 years, arrived at my 3-year anniversary on YouTube, which is absolutely insane and crazy to think about.
Yep.
And I talked to a lot of historians, a lot of authors over these past 3 years. And we've all talked about this particular question with the rise of AI and how there's a connection to the lockdown years, the COVID years, how a lot of us who were isolated, a lot of us historians who maybe couldn't go out to our local research libraries or gather sources, we had to get our sources online. And from there, a lot of us built our online platforms. There's one historian who's known as the owner of the Sicilian School, who teaches all about Sicilian history. He's an amazing historian. Another one of my good buddies, fellow historian, Courtney Atkins, he was able to get his own publication house where he specializes in military history, where he has 2 magazines, Hellfighter and In Command. And all of that and more, all these incredible indie historians have just flooded the market and have done their best to help preserve the truth. But as we also have been talking about before, AI within the last 5 years or so has gotten so advanced that you can't even tell what is AI or what is real in regards to either images or data or even just the dialogue itself. And it's a little frustrating and intimidating. And I remember talking with a guest on the show how AI can be used as a tool as it should, but it does not have a place in the creative sphere, regardless if you are an historian, an artist, anyone who is writing something, some kind of piece, whether it's technical writing, business writing, what have you. AI has no business in that regard. But that's not always the case. And a lot of content that we are seeing is AI generated and AI narrated. And sometimes it's not 100% correct. So ultimately, David, my question to you is this. With the rise of AI and how fast it is growing, and with the rise of independent historians who are trying to do their best to preserve history, do you feel that we are teetering between a golden age of historians and a dark age with the rise of generative AI?
I admire your choice of words there. And I think we are at that precipice of dangerous historical interpretation. And if we take one more step, we're going to fall off or teeter over the edge. And I like the way that you put that, the golden age of historians versus this new modern age. I do believe that AI has a place. It can be a tremendous tool to assist a researcher, especially one that is just getting into the field. It can help coalesce a lot of different sources into a readable form. But I think that what we need to do as historians, as teachers, as school administrators, is properly frame the AI as a research tool, not as a tool to actually generate prose or to generate a narrative. And an example I can give you, my wife, as I said, she was the director of a writing center at a local college. And just as she was retiring, they were starting to take on the issues of AI generated manuscripts at the college. And they have since instituted a whole new unit that is designed to teach the students how to properly use AI and to avoid AI, quote, plagiarism.
Mm.
So it's been identified in the academic world as a definite issue of interest. And I think as we move forward and we realize what AI is really not only designed to do, but what it's good at, and then use that tool in the proper sense. For instance, you're not going to you're not going to hammer a nail with a crescent wrench. You got to use the proper tool. And that's where AI comes in. It can be a tool, but it has to be used properly in order to get the maximum effect out of it. But if we are not careful about how AI is used, we run the real risk of badly distorting the historical record. And I'll go back to my earlier piece of advice is always use multiple sources, always use multiple references. Don't accept any one reference, even my own work. I would encourage people to do their own research. Never use a single point of reference for anything. If somebody tells you something, say, okay, great, thank you, but then go and look it up and verify it. Ronald Reagan used to say, trust but verify. And that really applies to history and historical research. Use the AI as a tool, take what it tells you, but go back and double check it. And I think as we move forward, the people that develop these AI systems will improve the algorithms and get them to be more accurate and to give out more accurate information. But history is really about human beings, and it should be human beings that write the history. If you're letting a machine write the history, you're running into the danger of having it misinterpreted. So it really needs to be human beings that write it and use it as a tool. I mean, just as the internet is now a prime tool. I mean, when I was a kid back in the 70s and 80s, I had to go to a library. I had to, jump on my bike or have my mom take me to the library if I wanted to do any sort of research. And nowadays, a couple of keystrokes and a mouse click, and I've got everything that I need. And there was a danger with the internet when it first came out, and we've now adapted to it, and people understand that how it can be used. And AI is just another example of that. And I'll go back to Ronald Reagan again, trust but verify.
Very true, David. Well spoken and well said. And that actually now leads into the business side of being an historian, which also correlates with the business side of being an historical author. Now, as a little icebreaker question, David, when you and your fellow co-author finished the book and published it, how did you go about marketing the book as best as you can? And looking back, is there anything you guys would have done differently?
Well, Rick and I were both very much newbies to writing a book, and so we were learning as we went along. Expect that you're going to get rejection letters, and Rick and I got numerous rejection letters before we finally found somebody that was willing to take it on. And it was a small publishing house, coincidentally back in my hometown in Michigan, in Ann Arbor. And 2020 hindsight being what it is, this is another thing that you need to do your research on. You need to understand who you are giving your long worked on manuscript, your pride and joy, who you're giving that manuscript to. I'm proud of my book. I'm proud of how it looks, but dealing with that particular publisher was not a good experience, and you need to be careful about that. If they don't give you a good vibe, if it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is, and you need to move on, and you need to go to a different location. At the end of the day, the book is out there. The book is in print. You can purchase it off of Amazon, and that's really what we wanted. We wanted to get that story out into the historical record. Rick and I didn't write this book to make $1 million off of it. That was not our goal. So in the end, that goal has been achieved, but you need to be very careful about who you hand it off to, and make sure that they're going to do right by it. The very first pass that the publisher gave us and said, this is how I want to publish the book, I looked at it and I couldn't believe what I was seeing, because it was terrible. It's like a third grader put it together. And my wife didn't like it. I didn't like it. Rick didn't like it. And we said, look, man, you're going to have to do something different, because this is just not what our vision was. And he initially put up the Heisman arm and said, no, this is how it's going to be published. And I said, no, it's not. And he eventually came around to see it our point of view, and it came out much better. But even in the format that it's in, there were certain things that I think could have been done differently. but again, that's all part of the learning process. It was our first book. It'll be Rick's only book, and hopefully I'll write another one, and I'll be a little bit wiser about it in the future. But again, I think the biggest thing that you need to be careful of is who you hand your manuscript to. Make sure that they're the right people.
Very true. And I think that can be used for all authors, regardless if they're historical authors or research authors. That is a very good piece of advice, David. So thank you for that. And as we now go into the business side, as the first question of this portion of the interview, this is probably one of my personal favorites in this section, and that is, of course, understanding our audience. As for me as a fiction writer, I've had to learn that I write a very certain way, and I want to showcase and highlight that, but I have to realize my style of writing is not going to be the same for everyone else, and it's understanding the genre that I'm writing in. Same thing for my other aspect of myself as a historical magazine writer. Again, I love writing about history, but as historians, we are taught to speak and write in a very certain way that is more academically sound, as opposed to those that are interested in history but may not understand the jargon. And there comes a moment when we're writing that we have to realize, okay, we have to showcase who we are as authors, as the historians, and as the researchers to let people know we've done the work. But we also don't want them to be bogged down by the jargon, by the academic verbiage that could completely throw people out. So it's this fine tightrope balance that we always find ourselves in. So again, going back to you and Rick, when you guys were working on that book, how did you find that sweet balance of telling the story that you wanted to tell while also being mindful of the audience in mind? Again, as you said, you didn't write this to make $1 million. You guys wanted to tell ultimately a powerful story and to tell these men's stories that had been forgotten. You wanted to do that first and foremost.
Right. Well, in general, my writing style tends to be very technical. I'm a technical person. The bulk of my work as a historian into submarine history has been on the technical side. Rick, on the other hand, my website partner and co-author, he's very interested in the human stories. And so that's why him and I meshed together quite well. He was telling the story of the men, their backgrounds, what motivated them, and I'm telling the story of the technical side. When I took over the primary authorship of the book, my first initial passes tended to be quite technical. And you've probably seen this in other military works, especially Navy. Like NASA, we can't hardly utter a sentence without it having at least one acronym in it, and sometimes multiple acronyms. And that can really blow the average reader away, and you can lose them very, very quickly. Right. And I found it was sometimes a difficult thing to balance telling a historically accurate and truthful account with realizing who I wanted to tell it to. We wanted to tell this general story of the R-14, but we wanted the average person on the street to be able to pick up the book and understand what we were talking about. And I mentioned before that my wife, Teresa, was my primary editor, and quite often she said, Dave, you need to go back and reword that because I don't understand what you're talking about. And she's a highly educated woman. And if she doesn't understand it, then that's an indication right there that, okay, I need to tone it back and reword it a little bit. And so you bring up a very good point. You need to decide what your audience is, and you need to write the book to that audience. And it is sometimes a very fine balancing line between telling historically accurate and technically accurate with readability. One of my favorite authors back here is an author by the name of Norman Friedman, and he writes reference works. And his style is incredibly accurate, incredibly reputable, but it's not very readable. And no offense to Norman, he's a great author. But this is not a book that you would hand to the average layperson on the street, say, hey, this is a book about submarine history, because they're just not going to get it. It's for researchers. So you have to avoid going far right and far left, and you have to find that road down the middle. And it's not an easy task. And that's where having a good editor comes in, someone who's somewhat detached from what you're writing that will give you the truth and say, look, you need to reword that. So yes, the finding your voice is not an easy process at times, and depending upon what you're writing. I've had several articles published by the Naval Submarine League in their journal called the Submarine Review. And those articles are written for fellow submariners and maritime professionals and naval architects. So the writing style is entirely different from writing my book. So sometimes you have to have two different writing styles. You have to have the ability to shift back and forth. But that is, writing style and your voice and deciding who your audience is are three very, very important aspects of writing, and especially historical writing.
Very true, David. Very, very true. And now let's talk a little bit about the website and how that came about. So walk us through it, David. How did you and Rick create the website? And is there a special meaning behind the name of your guys' website?
Well, the website started, it was probably 1996, 97 timeframe. Rick became fascinated with a photograph that he had gotten, and decided, I want to start sharing this kind of stuff with the public. So he created a website that he initially called Through the Looking Glass, kind of literary reference to looking into the past. And he created that website and was running it for several years. And in 2001, I was looking in the internet for submarine related stuff, as I was wont to do on occasions. Came across this site and saw a picture there, and I wrote him an email because there was something in the background that he hadn't seen or hadn't commented on, and I just pointed it out. And that began a 25+ year friendship and relationship. And for the first part of that, I was nothing more than really a consultant. Rick and I developed a friendship. This is the other kind of weird thing about our friendship. Rick lives in Seattle, and I live in Norfolk, Virginia. We are literally on opposite ends of the country. And while I was on active duty, I was in various other parts of the country and the world. And so most of the 25 years that I've known Rick, it's either been via phone call or email. We've actually only met in person about 6 times, but he is one of my best friends. At any rate, that one photograph kicked off a 25-year friendship. And for the first part of that, it was mostly I would give him some technical advice, or I'd help him out with picture captions or something of that nature. And several years back, he came to me and he says, Dave, he says, I'm getting older. He's in his 70s now, and his health is not as good as it used to be. And he asked me, would you take over the site? And I said, after I thought about it for a while, I said, sure, I'd be honored to, and thank you for thinking of me. And he said, well, I can't think of anybody else that could be better for it. So now we are still both listed as co-webmasters because it is Rick's creation. And Rick still has some input to it, although he's mostly looking after his health now and doesn't do a whole lot. The name pigboats.com was an outgrowth of the original website name, which was Through the Looking Glass. And pigboats, or pigboat, is an old term for a submarine.
Really?
Yes. And it comes from several different sources. The sailing age sailors, when they would see dolphins and porpoises in the water, they thought that the constant up and down swimming of the porpoises, they looked like pigs. So they would sometimes refer to them as sea pigs. The earliest submarines, the Holland and some of the earliest A-class submarines, they didn't have periscopes. So when they wanted to sight on the enemy to find out where they were at, they'd briefly pop up to the water and then submerge again. And some of the old-time sailors thought that constant up and down motion of the submarine as it was sighting the enemy looked a lot like the actions of a porpoise, also known as a sea pig. And there's the second part of that, is that the early submarines were very, very small. In some cases, they could be lifted up out of the water and put on the deck of a ship for long-range transport. In the U.S. Navy, any craft that can be carried on another one is called a boat. So you take the two terms and you put them together, pig and boat, and they became pig boats. Now, the term also became very apt when you take a look at the conditions inside the early submarines. There were your sanitary facilities consisted of an open bucket. There was very little, if any, fresh water. The temperatures inside the boat were horrendous. 80, 90, 100 degrees were common. So men were sweating. There was ozone from electrical fires, and you had battery acid, and you had all sorts of things going on inside these enclosed steel tubes under the water. Mm-hmm. And when they would come back into port, the men would come out of these submarines looking and smelling like pigs. So the surface ship sailors said, "Hey, look, here comes a pig boat." That was both a derogatory and an admirable term. Pig boats is an old term to describe submarines that really lasted up until about 1941, when a lot of those earlier conditions had been corrected. You had fresh water, you had showers, you had air conditioning, you had refrigeration, and a lot of those conditions had gone away by 1941. So Rick and I basically decided that the quote pig boat era of American submarine ended in 1941. So that's the focus of this site. The World War II eras and the post-war eras have been covered extensively by other sites, and I have a great deal of interest in those, but we decided to focus the site on the 1900 to 1941 era, which is what we call the pig boat era. And because it was a fascinating time of technological innovation, bravery, tragedy, and all sorts of other things. And that's how we decided to concentrate the site. Yep.
Very nice. Very, very nice, David. And as we near the end of this amazing historians interview, there are a few last questions that I did want to ask you. And
Sure.
This one, I think, is probably among one of the most important questions of this part of the interview. And that is, as historians and as researchers and as writers, we could talk about history for days on end. And when we're writing about history, we can continuously write and post several blog posts, several journal entries. But at the end of the day, and this kind of goes back into, again, we talk about, preserving the truth of history. There has to be a point where we have to trust the sources, trust in our abilities as writers and storytellers, preserving the truth, and know when to stop writing and to say it's finished. So for you, David, as a researcher and as an historian, how have you dealt with those two very important aspects as an author, a researcher, and an historian?
Well, I will relate the first part of that question to my book. At a certain point, you got to bring any manuscript to a close. You can continue writing. There's different avenues that I could have pursued in the book, expanded on a little bit more on Rick's earlier work. But at a certain point, you just have to draw it to a close. You can only do so much research. As a matter of fact, after the book came out and was published, Rick and I have turned up a couple of other facts and interesting, sidebars to the story that we said, gosh, I wish we would have gotten that into the story. But at a certain point, you just have to close it out.
Right.
Another example I can give is one of my favorite research historians named John Alden. He wrote the primer, the gold standard of American submarine history books. And even he was forced to make some compromises because, you know, you have to get the book to the publisher eventually. And I found out in recent, his book was written in 1979. In recent years, I've uncovered information, especially about the welding, that he didn't have in his book. And it's not that John Alden was, you know, he didn't get it right or he misunderstood it. It's just, I think he had to make a call, an editorial call. Okay, we need to get this to press. I got to stop looking at these research documents, and I need to get the book to press.
Right.
So, yeah, there's a certain point in which you have to call a day and move on. But one thing, though, I think I'm actually going to disagree with you on a little bit is this idea that history has a finite point to it. The study of history, you're never going to know everything. And as I've told this to Rick several times, it never ceases to amaze me how much of this stuff has been forgotten over the years. Things that people used to know, you know, passionately and know intimately, those people are now gone. And the knowledge died with them. And it's up to people like me and Rick and my other fellow historians to uncover that again. So history is never done. And when I'm gone, some of this history is going to get forgotten, and somebody in the future is going to rediscover it and republish it. So I really don't think that history is ever done. Another example I can give you is an author by the name of John Parshall. He's one of my inspirations. He's an amazing author, an incredibly detailed historian, and he wrote the definitive work on the Battle of Midway called Shattered Sword. I cannot recommend that book highly enough. John Parshall is very much a fact finder, and sometimes some of the facts that he puts out there will surprise people. He's not a revisionist. I don't like historical revisionism simply for revisionist sake, but he has retold the story of the Battle of Midway in such a way and have reframed that you really have a lot of those aha moments. It really helps you to understand. And if he hadn't gone back and looked at some of those past historical records and reinterpreted them, his book would have never been possible. So I really am an advocate of the idea that history is never finite. It's never done. And you should never stop taking a look at it. There's things that I've revised of my own work because I kept looking at it. A couple of specifics about submarine guns I revised in later editions of the visual guides because I learned more about it. So yeah, history is never done. It's never something that's going to have a finite end to it. Just when you think you've learned all that you can learn about it, something else pops up, some new document comes up, some new book is written, and you say, oh my God, I never knew that. And that's one of the things that interests me most. Just when you think you've got it all figured out, you get surprised. And you have one of those revelation moments, and that's what makes history so much fun for me.
Beautifully said, David, and I do agree. I absolutely agree. And now we arrive at the final two questions of this amazing historian's interview. Now,
Okay.
David, we talked about a lot of things. You provided such great insight into your background as a historian, excerpts from your times in the service, working with your friend Rick on co-authoring the book and the website and the mission statement you guys had with both projects and more, and given such great insight onto, you know, how to look at being an historian and as an author from a technical standpoint and as a personal standpoint. All great feedback and answers to all these questions, David. Ultimately, here are the final two. With everything we've talked about, at the end of the day, what do you want people to take away from your work, from your approach to history, and everything afterwards? And I think I've already answered this question in great detail, but maybe you can go a little bit more in depth. To a lot of the historians, writers, and possibly individuals who want to serve in the military, regardless of which branch they choose, what is your word of wisdom to them?
The takeaways, my major goal is to enable a greater understanding of the modern current world by understanding how it came to be. A friend that I had here in Norfolk several years ago had no idea of the history behind how the Norfolk Naval Base was founded, and those acts, or those actions that led to the founding of Naval Station Norfolk, in part is what brought me here to Virginia. I'm a native of Michigan, but I live in Virginia now with my wife. And because that naval station was founded, I wound up here and was her friend, right? And if you can understand how the historical context, you can have a better understanding of your current world. And that's my major goal. That's the main takeaway that I want people to have from my work, is not just knowing the facts and the figures and the who's, what's, and whens, but to understand the modern world because you understand the history that led up to it. And what was the second part of that again? I'm sorry.
Of course. The second part of the question was, and I think you may have answered it in the beginning with another question, but maybe you can go a little more in depth, and that is, what is your word of wisdom to fellow historians, fellow writers, and individuals who want to enlist and join in the armed forces?
Okay, excellent question. Go into the armed forces for the right reasons. Decide what those reasons are and follow up on it. And understand that the armed forces, doesn't matter which service it is not an easy life. You are going to be asked to make many sacrifices. You're going to be asked to make miss a lot of birthdays, a lot of Christmases. You're going to be asked to go to some pretty crappy parts of the world and do some pretty crappy jobs. But at the end of the day, it is all worth it. You become part of something larger than yourself, and you are serving your fellow citizens. President Kennedy said it very, very well once, and I still have this plaque in my office about any man who may be asked what he has done to make his life worthwhile can say with a great deal of pride and satisfaction, I served in the United States Navy. And that's the biggest thing about serving in any military, is that it can make your life worthwhile. You take the gift of life that has been given you, and you turn around and you turn it into service to your fellow citizens and keeping the United States safe, not only for democracy, but safe for everything that you hold dear. And that's one of the prime reasons for serving. But understand before you sign on that proverbial dotted line that you are signing up for one of the toughest existences you're ever going to ask for. I can't tell you the number of birthdays and Christmases that I missed, important events. Yeah, it's a tough life, but it's a worthwhile life. And so do your research, decide what you want to do, and commit to it. When I had a young sailor sitting at my desk that was newly reporting to the command, I always asked him, why did you join the Navy? And you would be surprised at the number of responses that you would get. Some of them good and some of them bad. The bad responses led me to believe I'm going to need to keep an eye on this person. The good responses were well thought out, and you knew that this was going to be a good sailor. So, yeah, think about it beforehand, put a lot of thought into it, ask your family, your parents, your brothers, your sisters, get a lot of different input, but understand what you're doing and understand that you're going to have to make sacrifices in order to make your life worthwhile.
Beautifully said, David. Beautifully said. And what about our fellow historians and writers? What would your advice to them be?
Persistence. Persist in the pursuit of historical truth. Never rest on your laurels. Keep asking questions, and always double check everything. Never rely on a single source. That's the biggest trip up of most historians, is that they rely on a single source, and you sometimes will get a distorted view of history. I've had, commonly held beliefs that I had when I was younger that have since been overturned. John Parshall is one of those that has helped give me a better understanding, because you never stop pursuing and you never rely on a single source. That's the biggest single thing I could say. You never rely on a single source of information. Always double check it.
Perfect, David. Absolutely perfect. A fitting end to this amazing historians interview. And as a fellow announcement I want to make, our 500th video on the channel, viewers
Oh,
and
awesome.
listeners. So
Awesome.
again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us for another amazing, incredible episode here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I want to give a huge thank you to our guest, Mr. David Johnston, for coming on the show, making his official debut. Now, David, where can people find you on the internet if they want to reach out and connect, as well as buy a copy of yours and Rick's book for their collection?
Well, my website is very simple. It's www.pigboats.com. You type that in and you're going to go to the site. If you want to learn a little bit more about me, there's a tab about the Pigboat staff and contact info. And at the bottom of every page on pigboats.com is our email address, which is just simply webmaster@pigboats.com. You can contact me through there. My book, A Good and Favorable Wind, is available on Amazon. You can buy it there. And I would encourage you to do so. It would make a great Christmas gift for anybody that is interested in military history. It's there. It's ready to go. So take a look at it. There's also a page on pigboats.com about it. I didn't tell a whole lot because I want you to read the book. But there's further pictures about the R-14 and all other U.S. submarines from 1900 to 1941 on the site. Take a look. We do update it regularly. About twice a month, I put updates on it, so it is not a static site. It is always changing. And also take a look at the pages for the Dorado project. That's one of the other major side projects that I'm involved in. And so take a look at those pages as well. It'll make very interesting reading.
Absolutely. I will link all that down below in the description of this video, viewers and listeners. And as, again, another final note, my fourth book, Decimus, the Wolf of Rome, an historical fantasy epic, is still available for pre-order. I will link that down below. It will release Christmas Eve on Barnes & Noble and Amazon in print and digital form. So if you haven't gotten a copy yet and probably want to get mine and David's book as a bundle, just go to our respective profiles on Amazon, purchase a copy, and just leave your reviews. Reviews are very, very helpful for us authors and as historians. So, again, I will link all that down below in the description of this video for you all. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another amazing historians interview here and our 500th episode to date. A huge thank you to David for coming on the show. And if you would like to see him back on the show again for season 4 of the Historians Lounge, and possibly in a solo episode or in a Historians Double, as I like to call it, like this video, subscribe, and comment down below. And as always, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, signing out. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Happy holidays, everybody. Merry Christmas. And I wish you all from the Wandering Scribe a happy new year. Take care, and we'll see you in the next episode.